Hello and welcome to the Here For You podcast. In this podcast we explore topics of psychology, philosophy, mental health and therapy, as well as the intersections between these disciplines. If you'd like to support the show, please visit the Patreon page. The link for this can be found in the show notes of the podcast. Also stick around to the end of the podcast to hear about more details of workshops, different ways you can support, and upcoming shows as well. Have a good listen. Hi, in this episode of the podcast, we'll be looking at emotional regulation. So we'll be exploring what emotional regulation is, and in that we'll be exploring the differences between regulation versus dysregulation. We'll go on to explore the possible causes of emotional regulation and dysregulation, and then we'll go on to look at clinical applications, so how we can influence our own emotional regulation and perhaps help and aid in the emotional regulation of other people. Okay, so what is emotional regulation? So from a broad perspective, emotional regulation refers to the goal-directed process through which individuals attempt to elicit, change, or maintain emotional states. Perhaps traditionally this was perceived as a individualistic brain and body sort of type of thing. So that idea that actually people regulate their emotions through their mind or their brain and through a very individualistic stance. However, more recent conceptualizations and understandings of emotional regulations have aimed to incorporate the role of the social world. So how other people in social situations can help to regulate and influence people's emotions. So this brings together a wider, sort of more holistic idea about emotional regulation to include aspects of the biological, the psychological, and the social. Largely speaking, this can inform a biopsychosocial model of emotional regulation. One thing that really is important about emotional regulation when it comes to mental health, both in terms of the mental health profession, but also understanding and conceptualizations of mental health, is that the concept of emotional regulation seems to transcend a lot of presentations and diagnoses. So this idea of whether somebody is in a place of emotional regulation or whether they're in a place of emotional dysregulation seems to be present across a lot of different types of mental health or mental ill health presentations. You see this in depression and anxiety, but also aspects of schizophrenia, as well as more general aspects of well-being. So emotional regulation as a concept seems to transcend across diagnosis, across different presentations, and can sometimes be a really useful way of people and clinicians understanding something that might unify all different challenges that people may face in relation to mental health and well-being. Okay, so some of the differences between regulation and dysregulation, very broadly speaking. So emotional regulation is often sort of described as being able to control and influence an emotional state. So the ability to have an understanding of one's emotions and be able to have some sort of influence over what that emotional state that somebody is in has. Psychological flexibility, so the ability to feel lots of different emotions simultaneously. Feeling angry and sad, angry and happy, feeling these things in a flexible way and being able to move between them quite freely and hold them at the same time. That a range of emotions is experienced in a manageable way, so that lots of different emotions may be able to be experienced, but that these are actually experienced in a way that is not overwhelming for the individual, or not mostly overwhelming for the individual. And regulation also looks like a co-regulated experience through attunement to others. So this can be a regulation that we receive from other people through them being attuned to us, as well as the ability to help others to regulate their emotions through attunement with them. And attunement describes the connected experience that two people have together, and this is often found in terms of how it visually looks. It often looks like eye contact or possibly touch, and very small facial features that display connected emotions and a display of similar emotions between people. Contrary to regulation, dysregulation describes an inability to control or influence an emotional state. So being very stuck in an emotion or jumping from emotions very, very quickly in a way that feels very unmanageable. Psychological inflexibility, so the inability to feel different emotions at the same time in a way that's manageable, and that a range of emotions is often experienced as overwhelming, or on the other side of that spectrum, not experiencing any emotion at all. So it's not a range of emotions or a very limited experience of one or two emotions. So people who are dysregulated may feel a lot of emotion in a very overwhelming and unmanageable way, and they may also feel at other times a complete flat effect, so no emotions at all, or a complete distancing from one's emotions. And while regulated emotions look like co-regulated experiences, dysregulation often takes the form of disengaged or abusive experiences of others. So people who find themselves in regular dysregulated states may have had quite traumatic experiences growing up, or very frequent experiences of disengaged caregivers, and therefore finding it quite hard for themselves to regulate their own emotions later in life. Just speaking about that co-regulation a little bit more. So what emotional co-regulation is it's the impact that interpersonal relationships have on intrapersonal processes. So the impact that interpersonal relationships, so relationships between people, has on the internal workings and the internal processes of people's brains and people's minds. This co-regulation is achieved through empathetic engagement and attunement with the others. This is particularly impactful in early childhood, from a primary caregiver to a child. And as mentioned earlier, this is typically displayed in eye contact, tone of voice, facial expression, and touch. Often these expressions are very, very small micro expressions that held between people and held between a primary caregiver and a child, and then later held between two people within an interaction that is co-regulated. There is evidence of the biological impact of early co-regulation, and this evidence seems to suggest that the impact of a positive co-regulation relationship or interaction in early infancy has very positive impacts on brain development and also on physiology. And likewise, the opposite has been found, where poor emotional co-regulation in early infancy has been found to impact upon brain development and physiology. Okay, so that's a little bit of a exploration around what emotional regulation is, what dysregulation and regulation is, and then a little exploration around what co-regulation is. So I'm just kind of thinking a little bit about what the causes are, so what might cause emotional regulation or emotional dysregulation. Some of those factors are often very complex and multiple, and there's lots of things that can kind of go into the ability of an individual to regulate their emotions, or the chances of somebody finding themselves frequently in a dysregulated state. Some things like this start almost preconception, so there can be genetic variations, specifically relating to serotonin and dopamine production. So this can be a genetic inheritance that is almost predisposed, I guess, before somebody is even conceived, based off of the genetic information that they may be receiving from their biological parents. Pre-birth, there can be factors that influence or cause challenges with emotional regulation, or predispose an ability to have positive emotional regulation. So within the womb, cortisol is transmitted to the developing fetus from the mother based on the levels of stress. So if a mother is under a lot of stress, the cortisol levels can be passed to the child within the womb, and that it's been shown to have an impact on an infant's ability to emotionally regulate throughout their childhood. You could sort of see how this may have an impact in certain issues of chronic stress that some mothers may be subjected to. And then post-birth as well, there can be causes just after birth, so the attachment between the baby and the primary caregiver, and whether the caregiver is soothing the baby through the tone of voice, the eye contact, or the physical touch, or whether there is abuse or neglect even in those early stages of birth. It can really impact upon somebody's ability to regulate their emotions or find themselves in frequent dysregulation. And then in early development, so after the birth period and after the early infancy, the presence of multiple ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, which we talked about in a previous podcast episode, can put a child into a chronic state of stress. So the higher amount of ACEs that person has, the higher level of abuse or neglect or challenges within that person's childhood, the more likely that person is to be in a chronic state of stress, and therefore the more likely it is that they will face challenges with regulating their emotions through that chronic state of stress that they find themselves in. These are just some of the factors that contribute to somebody's ability to emotionally regulate, or the challenges with dysregulation. And the factors are very multifaceted, and there's a very wide literature on this. However, some of the important considerations that I think is important to consider any of the possible causes of emotional regulation is that emotional regulation is a very, very complicated process that humans have evolved or have the ability to do. It involves many aspects of emotional competency. These include appropriate awareness of one's own emotions, the ability to understand others' emotions, the capacity for empathy, and the ability to distinguish personal emotional experience from external emotional expression. And this is quite a complex series of cognitive tasks that is asked of a human being in the aspect of emotional regulation. So first of all, they've got to have an awareness of what their emotions are, and then the ability to understand what those emotions are, and then also the ability to understand not only what their emotions are, but what another person's emotions are. And within that, the ability to empathize with that person based off of an understanding of what those emotions that they're feeling are. And then further, it involves that ability to distinguish between the personal emotions that somebody feels and the expression of those emotions, and distinguish that just because somebody feels a series of emotions, the expression of that may look different in different people, and it may look different in themselves as well. All this is to say that emotional regulation involves a lot of very complex abilities that humans have. So understandably, it's really a challenging thing that people face, and actually a remarkable thing that we're able to do. So understandably, it's a very complex phenomenon. Another important consideration is that what is considered to be a desirable emotion varies across individuals, cultures, and age. So there's going to be a lot of variability about what is defined as the appropriate expression of emotion, or the appropriate emotions that one feels, and this will be true between individuals, but also between cultures and between different time points in history. It's important that we consider that emotional regulation probably looks very different now than it did 50, 60 years ago, and it looks probably quite different in Western culture than in other cultures as well. Very important thing, particularly when working with clients from a different culture, a different age, and even just on a different individual level. Okay, so with that in mind, how might we regulate our own emotions, and how might we help others to regulate their emotions? So some practical steps here. I think therapy is uniquely positioned to provide a corrective emotional co-regulative relationship. Often people who, as we spoke about earlier, Often people who struggle with emotional dysregulation or struggle to regulate their emotions have come from early relationships and repeated relationships that have not provided a co-regulative space for them. Therapy can perhaps offer a unique opportunity to provide that person with an example of a corrective emotional co-regulative relationship. So a space where co-regulation might be able to happen, possibly even for the first time for somebody. That can be incredibly powerful. As well as a space for psychoeducation, sort of talking about what emotional regulation is, looking at some techniques, but actually maybe the relationship of therapy itself can be healing through providing that co-regulated space. Mindfulness practice, Daniel Segal talks quite a lot about this, and that mindfulness practices can really help with emotional regulation in the moment, and that part of how this can work is through the regulating of the bodily expression of emotion, which then helps to regulate the emotions themselves. So through mindfulness practice, through meditation, there may be an ability to slow down a racing heart, to take deeper breaths, which then may have a consequence upon the emotional expression that people feel. Daniel Siegel has elaborated on this model through the window of tolerance. People who are interested in finding out more about that, I will include a link to some literature on that in the show description. Do feel free to kind of check that out. The window of tolerance is a great tool for understanding how people can find themselves in either a hyper-aroused place, so feelings that are typically experienced as a heightened arousal, such as anxiety, anger, overwhelm, fight or fright, hypervigilance, or hypo-aroused. So the other end of that sort of spectrum, people may feel a dysregulation based off of feelings of being hypo-aroused, so a lower arousal rate or very low arousal rate, often typical in feelings of feeling very numb, very shut down, withdrawn, freezing, and depression. And the idea of the window of tolerance is that people will naturally find a place where they fluctuate between hyper and hypo-aroused, and that happens for all of us based off of lots of things, based off of the context that we find ourselves in, based off of even things like our diet, our histories and things like that, and the contexts of what we're getting involved with in the situations that we find ourselves in. But that if we can find a window of that variation or that fluctuation between hyper and hypo-aroused that is manageable or tolerable, so a range of variation that doesn't feel too overwhelming for us, then that's a great way of conceptualizing how emotional regulation can be achieved. When working with people, when it comes to emotional regulation, it's really important to identify what works from an individual and dynamic perspective. So acknowledging that there will be variability in emotional regulations both between and within individuals. So this is to say that it's got to be meaningful for the person that you're working with. It's not necessarily one sort of technique of working with emotional regulation that will work universally or for everybody or even for the same person over time. There needs to be acknowledgement that people are different from each other, but also that they're dynamic, that they change over time and their needs change over time. So the idea of what's emotionally regulating for them will be individual and specifically meaningful for them. So rather than giving generic techniques, it's really important to understand what would be meaningful for that person, what's meaningful in their emotional regulation journey. One way that can be achieved is through the idea of a sort of emotional regulation toolbox. So you can kind of conceptualize this idea of, okay, well, what's a series of things that might be helpful in maintaining your emotional regulation? What's a series of things you can draw on when you find yourself in a dysregulated state? And again, finding a series of tools that are meaningful for that person, rather than generic. One of the ways that I found really helpful in doing this is actually separating out the difference between tools that people may draw on to regulate their emotions in a sort of maintenance way, and tools that they may draw on to regulate their emotions in a crisis moment. And there may be slightly different tools, and the idea could be here that, okay, well, what's something that you do regularly that helps you to maintain a emotionally regulated state? For me personally, this is stuff like listening to music regularly, talking to people regularly, reading, exercising, those types of things. And sometimes what I notice is that if one or two of those things start to leave my life, then I start to find myself more easily in a dysregulated state, or finding it harder to regulate my emotions. So that's sort of maintenance things, and then thinking about, okay, well, what stuff I can draw on in the moment when I'm finding myself, okay, I'm really dysregulated now, or I feel in a bit of a chaotic state or a bit of a depressed state. And then there can be a series of different things that could be speaking to a particular person that is, useful and is really important as a co-regulated relationship. There can also be various sort of breathing exercises. So the classic breathing in for 4, holding for 2, breathing out for 6, as well as the sort of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise of what's 5 things that you can see, what's 4 things that you can hear, what's 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. These sort of grounding experiences can help people to immediately find a place of emotional regulation in a crisis period. Okay, so with all that in mind, just bringing everything to a conclusion. Emotional regulation is a goal-directed process through which individuals attempt to elicit, change, or maintain emotional states. It is perhaps best understood from a biopsychosocial perspective, so incorporating something that is integrating biological, psychological, and social ideas into the understanding of how dysregulation happens, but also how people may find a place of regulation. The concept appears present in most mental health struggles, so it transcends diagnosis typically. Emotional regulation transcends the individual to incorporate the concept of emotional co-regulation as well. Causes of differences in ability are multifactored and likely build upon each other. So the idea of actually there's not necessarily one single thing that causes emotional regulation or emotional dysregulation, but actually there's probably likely multiple factors, right from preconception all the way through pre-birth, early years, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, stuff all the way through there that probably builds upon themselves, both in the sense of builds upon challenges with emotional regulation, but actually builds upon somebody's ability to positively emotionally regulate themselves. It kind of works both ways there. And in this, perhaps therapy can provide a space of emotional co-regulation and an ability to explore and identify meaningful individual emotional regulation strategies. Okay, thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you, and bye now. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're interested in supporting the show, please do visit the Patreon link in the show description. There's various different packages involved in the Patreon page, right from just supporting the show to further access to additional resources and access to workshops. You can also visit us on the website hereforyoucounselling.com. That's hereforyoucounselling.com. Again, a link within the show description. If you'd like to book onto additional workshops, there's also a link to the Eventbrite page in the show description. There's a variety of in-depth discussions around lots of the topics that we talk about in the show today. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show.